So thanks again for inviting me. I feel honored to be on the roster on this virtual seminar series. Of course, long ago, I wouldn't have ever guessed that we are going to
Yes,
be
hello.
I'm not sure, but can you guys hear me?
Yes, very good. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so not long ago, I never would have guessed that we are going to be all on house arrest and everything is going to be virtual. But I hope everybody is doing well, healthy, and safe. And good luck for the semester we are all going to do. The other thing I never would have guessed is that I would get a microphone like this, and I'm you have the same microphone now. So in any case, thanks again for inviting me. The paper I'm going to be presenting is joint with Clemencian and Irina Stepnescu, and the title of the paper is Revenue Sharing in 401k plans. So essentially what we are going to talk about today more generally is mutual funds. And so in the mutual fund industry, we often have intermediaries that connect investors and funds. Essentially, all distribution channels would have some kind of an intermediary, so except for the direct distribution channel. So you can think of supermarkets, mutual fund supermarkets. Here you would actually have the supermarket platform as the intermediary. Advisory channel would be another example where financial advisors would serve as your financial intermediaries. And as I mentioned, we are going to focus on the largest distribution channel for mutual funds, which is retirement plans. It turns out that intermediaries in the mutual fund industry can have a wide range of compensation structures. You can think about it as a spectrum that goes from fully direct compensation to indirect compensation, and anything in between, any kind of mixture in between. And so today we are going to focus on indirect compensation, and what we are going to ask is, does indirect compensation affect the fees and the investor choices in these distribution channels? So as I mentioned, we are going to look at the retirement channel. Within the retirement channel, one slice is 401k plans. 401k plans are employer-sponsored defined contribution plans, and really the private sector equivalent of what we all have, which are 403b plans. So these are really, really similar to 403b plans. As of 2018, about $5.3 trillion were invested in these plans. And in terms of where those assets went, 60% of it actually goes to mutual funds. I got excited about studying 401k plans and retirement in general, because it seems like it's a very important question. If you think about it, for most participants, most employees today, the main source of retirement wealth is coming from 401k savings. And right, basically Social Security and everything else is becoming much less important. And so it's extremely important to make sure that these plans are set up and structured such that employees have a chance to have sufficient retirement savings in the future. The other thing I wanted to kind of talk about just a little bit, and I'm still just kind of priming this, and some of this information is well known to most of you, is how 401k plans are administered. Typically what happens is the plan sponsor, and by plan sponsor we mean the employer. So imagine IBM setting up a 401k plan for its employees. Typically the plan sponsor relies on intermediaries to set up the plan and also to maintain the plan. These intermediaries are mostly mutual funds, but can be also banks or consulting companies. And the primary intermediary or service provider in the mutual fund space or in the retirement space is going to be the record keeper. So we are going to be focusing on record keeper compensation. But one more thing that's important to note is that record keepers often offer other services as well. So they may be plan trustees and custodians. They may offer investment advisory services to both the plan and also the participants. They often have their own investment choices offered on the plan, so proprietary funds. So in that sense, they can also offer investment management services, and they can also offer financial education to plan participants. So this issue is gonna be important for us. Essentially, as I mentioned, the record keeper is often gonna be a bundled provider. So some of the fees that it's receiving is not just for record keeping services, but for a host of other services that it might provide for the plan. As I mentioned, just like in other distribution channels, the record keeper may receive direct or indirect compensation. Direct payments can come from participants or the sponsor, and indirect payments are going to be coming through third-party funds. I'm going to have a graph for you guys to kind of illustrate that, but that's kind of the structure of the compensation. And essentially, again, in this paper, we are going to ask whether the compensation structure itself affects the fees that you see and the menu offerings that you also see in this setting. Let me kind of state my research questions. And so basically what we're gonna do in this paper is we are going to ask whether indirect compensation, which I'm gonna be referring to as revenue sharing, affects the set of investment options that you see in 401k plans. We're also going to ask whether revenue sharing funds or funds that actually participate in the indirect compensation scheme are more expensive. And if they are more expensive, is it because they are maybe better funds? They perform better. And so these are questions that we're going to be looking at. And we're also going to say, just because revenue sharing funds are more expensive, maybe that's actually offset by lower direct fees. And so we're also going to ask whether revenue sharing plans in and of themselves are more expensive. And in the final part of the paper, we are going to try to think about why there is revenue sharing and what determines the magnitude of the revenue sharing. So let me kind of run through my results quickly, and then we can stop for a second, as Andre suggested. So what we find in this paper is that, indirect compensation actually affects the menu design. So funds that participate in the indirect compensation scheme are less likely to be deleted from revenue sharing plans, and they're more likely to be added to these menus as well. Revenue sharing funds tend to be more expensive, and this is not offset by performance. In fact, they tend to underperform non-sharing funds. Now, if you look at why, the bulk of this underperformance is going to be due to higher fees, but even after accounting for fees, they're going to be slightly worse than non-sharing funds. All in all, the higher expense ratio is not going to be offset by lower direct fees. And so what you'll see is that revenue sharing plans tend to be more expensive for plan participants. And as I mentioned in the last part of the talk, I'm going to think about why there is revenue sharing and what determines the magnitude. And so what generally we are seeing is that revenue sharing is going to be higher when the record keeper is more influential, and it's going to be actually lower when the management company is going to be is going to have an influential role in the retirement setting. So I don't know, Andre, if there are any questions, I can stop here or I can go a little bit further.
Just as you paused, the question started coming. So do revenue sharing funds have different objectives or serve different clienteles?
So these are going to be really good questions. Generally speaking, I'm going to have a couple of graphs. For instance, when we only look at, for instance, domestic equity funds, there is going to be, variation within that as well. But one major concern for our study is going to be whether somehow revenue sharing funds are different and whether revenue sharing plans are different. And so we're going to be kind of looking at for this, and I'm going to show you some results that are going to be within fund. So we are going to look at the very same fund across different menus. Some of these menus, that fund is going to be revenue sharing on, and some of these menus, it's not going to be revenue sharing on. So, but I think that you guys are already kind of thinking about exactly the issues that we're going to be very mindful of throughout this paper.
So given that people follow incentives and given everything we already know from this literature, what's the most surprising result here?
That's a good question too. So I think we don't know that much about. So you guys are right. The incentives are going to be interesting in this setting, and in some sense, incentives are going to be going to have straightforward implications. In some sense, if I can persuade you that that indirect compensation helps the record keeper to essentially collect more rent, it makes sense for the record keeper to push for indirect compensation, and also to prefer funds that actually participate in this scheme. So in that sense, it's not going to be very surprising in those dimensions. I think what some of the interesting parts come from the network structure of the providers that I'm going to be talking about here. I'll also talk a little bit about regulation around these schemes. And finally, one more interesting thing is that if we had full transparency, and again, we are kind of jumping the gun because I'm going to have a few slides on this as well. If we had full transparency such that I could completely observe all the compensation that these providers receive, even then it would be kind of interesting to ask which one is a better scheme. And it's not clear that direct compensation is a better or a more fair scheme for compensation arrangements. But like I said, if you don't mind, we can kind of postpone these very kind of good questions to the slides that I have coming up.
So here's a question about some clarification of what you do in the paper. So can you clarify the revenue sharing between the record keeper and the mutual funds? If so, what is if the mutual fund is a record keeper? So basically, I think to rephrase it, if a record keeper offers his own mutual funds, what is a trade-off between offering one of its own funds versus basically entering into the revenue sharing agreement with an outside fund provider?
This is also a very good question. So, and in fact, these are, so Irina Clemens and I also have a paper, an earlier paper where we look at affiliated funds, the proprietary funds of these providers. And so we've been kind of struggling with these questions quite a bit. So offering your own funds seems to be a very, almost the first best for the record keeper, especially if it's a fidelity type record keeper, when they could easily offer a variety of their own funds. There are all these different frictions and pressures in the industry. There seems to be kind of an argument for what we'll call open architecture. So a lot of plans for best practices are pushing for non-affiliated funds on the menu. A lot of the times you hear the argument that this will actually help competition within the menu. Now, I really don't want to go off on this on this conversation because we could have a really long conversation about it. My co-authors and I are not persuaded that bringing in these funds will actually create competition, simply because the record keeper is a little bit of a gatekeeper in terms of what can come in and not. So in any case, in fact, the fact that funds offer revenue share incentivizes the record keeper to allow some of these unaffiliated funds on the menu. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see this. And clearly, one more thing I wanted to say about this is in the DOI disclosure requirements that I'm going to use to figure out how much revenue share there is between the record keeper and mutual fund companies, the disclosure is limited to unaffiliated funds. And so, as you mentioned, if you have an affiliated fund on the menu, you can, you can do the same scheme or overcharge participants through that fee as well. You're not going to be observing that. You're only going to be observing unaffiliated kind of funds and their revenue share to the record keeper.
Okay, I have a few more questions. Again, feel free to deflect them until latest. So can you quantify the loss, if any, to the average pension investor? Is it clear that investors are worse off? If so, by how much?
So we're not going to have a dollar figure. We had the same issue in our other paper. Essentially, we could do a back of the envelope calculation, but of course I can assume all kinds of parameters on investment horizon and everything else. I'm going to have some numbers for you in terms of how much higher fees are, for instance, for revenue sharing plans and things like that. So, but I won't have encompassing dollar figure that would actually quantify it all.
Do employers get kickbacks from funds they select?
So this is also a very, very good question. To be honest, we are gonna be very silent on how the employer itself selects the service provider. And so, if you have conversations with people about it, different people have different ideas and wining and dining events and record keepers competing for retirement assets, but we actually do not have any idea. Now, of course, the sponsor itself will have some incentives. So the sponsor may itself prefer some of these indirect arrangements because in principle that would mean that they could actually report lower administrative costs. So that's going to be a really good question that I'm going to come back to this in a little while, but like I said, we're not going to have much to say about this, but there is definitely an incentive from the sponsor side as well to hide some of the fees.
Okay, last question at this point. How do the indirect compensation effects interact with direct compensation effects? Could they serve as substitute or complements?
So the way we think about it, and again, I'll talk about this a little bit. This should actually be, so essentially what should happen is if the participants are already paying for record keeping services through indirect payments, this should actually reduce the direct payments that they are charged. And in a minute, I'm going to tell you that this doesn't seem to be the case. So they should actually be substitutes, but that's exactly the problem that you're gonna see in this setting. That there's not a dollar for dollar reduction across these two different payment schemes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so like I said, very good questions already, and so I quickly wanted to give you a graph, and again, I'm gonna fly through this fairly quickly because I think everybody already kind of understands what's going on here. But we have the plan sponsor, and the plan sponsor is gonna be working with the record keeper and other service providers, but like I said, mostly the record keeper, to come up with a set of investment choices. I said that 401k plans are very similar to 403b plans. It seems though that 401k plans tend to have a smaller menu, so a more limited menu than we have, for instance, in academia through 403 plans. Participants then contribute to their retirement savings, and in most cases, the sponsor is going to be contributing as well. And all those contributions go self-directed by participants into the investment options. As I mentioned, you're going to have a record keeper who, at the minimum, will have to keep records. We'll have to kind of keep up with who is transacting, how much money is going where. And so there's, you could pay the service provider or the record keeper directly, which just means that participants would pay administrative fees or the sponsor would pay administrative fees. What happens often in these plans is that the payment is going to be indirect. So plan participants will pay to the fund on the menu, and then the fund kicks back to the record keeper or service provider. Now, the problem with the payment scheme is going to be that these indirect compensation arrangements are going to be largely non-transparent. Now, the transparency issue has improved, so we've gone through some regimes lately. In fact, in our paper, we are gonna use data that got mandated in 2009. 2009, the Department of Labor said service providers will just have to disclose how much kickback they are getting from the different options. So you go on Form 5500, Schedule C, and you're going to see this information on the payer-payee level. So you're going to see, I don't know, T. Rowe Price target date fund 2025, paid fidelity 25 basis points. Now, interestingly, even though in 2009 it became, mandated to disclose this information, this is going to be one of those cases where transparency is not transparent at all. Surveys after this disclosure requirement report that plan sponsors have absolutely no idea how much indirect payments there are. And if you have ever played with that data, you would actually realize why. So we spent a lot of time cleaning the data. And in fact, unfortunately, we had to throw plans away where we knew there is indirect compensation. There was Schedule C, Part 3 filed. But when you look at the indirect compensation disclosure itself, it's actually non-informative whatsoever. There are no numbers. It just says basis points per assets and things like that. So that disclosure regime, I think, did absolutely nothing to make disclosures a little bit more transparent. The second regime was a little bit more popular and more effective. In fact, again, the Department of Labor started requiring service providers to directly report to plan sponsors as opposed to reporting to the Department of Labor. And there is some evidence, in fact, your colleague Dominique at UIC has a paper that looks at that disclosure reform. But by and large, surveys still show that participants and plan sponsors still do not have much of an idea in terms of how much is being paid indirectly to the record keeper, which means that the record keeper, if they wish, they could actually double charge participants through charging administrative fees as well. Now, the last thing I wanted to say about this is that the Government Accountability Office in 2011 did do a study and found that that record keepers tend to overcharge through not reducing the direct fees, even though they're getting compensation indirectly through these third-party funds. So let me show you kind of a little bit about what you would see in a 401k plan. As I mentioned, a lot of the times you see open architecture. So this seems to be best practices in the retirement industry. And so a lot of the times, for instance, here, Fidelity is the record keeper, but Fidelity is only offering a couple of investment options on the menu. Now, of course, there's a lot of money in those investment options. There is another thing that you tend to see, that the record keeper will try to offer options that are going to be popular. So the cheapest index funds and things like that are going to be offered by the record keeper. You also have a bunch of other options offered by unaffiliated management companies. And then if you can see on the bottom, typically there is employer stock. That's also an investment option, and participants can take out loans. So you're going to see that in the assets as well. So we collect this information from Form 500, where you're going to observe the current value of these investments. We then match it, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, with CRISP. And so we have the corresponding expense ratio of those funds. And from Form 5500, we collect the revenue share. So in this particular instance, you see that almost all third-party funds are actually revenue sharing with the record keeper, with the notable exception of Vanguard. What you're gonna see in the vast majority of retirement plans, Vanguard is unwilling to revenue share with the record keeper. And in fact, I think that's true for fund supermarkets as well. Just recently, Vanguard got kicked off of one of the supermarkets exactly for the same reason. So in any case, you have the unaffiliated options, the affiliated options, and some other stuff on the menu. Here's another example of a menu. Here, T. Rowe Price is the record keeper. This is a more typical setting. Here, T. Rowe Price basically offers the majority of the investment options on the menu, including index funds and also the target date funds that tend to be default options. And you can kind of see that we have third-party funds. You can observe the revenue share. Again, Vanguard is not revenue sharing with the record keeper, and there is another fund that's not revenue sharing. So all in all, what we have in our data is we are going to have variation across plans. There are going to be some plans that are only direct compensation, and there are going to be some plans where you have indirect compensation. There is going to be variation within the plan itself. So revenue sharing plans will have funds that revenue share, and there are going to be funds that do not. And another source that we're going to be able to tap into is within fund variation. So the very same fund is going to be on various menus across our plans in the same year. And that very same fund may or may not revenue share, and the amount of revenue share may actually differ across different menus. And so the way you're going to see those differences is they're going to pop up, not just, of course, in the revenue share that we collect, but in a minute I'll show you that it's going to show, of course, in the expense ratio. And so how can you have the very same fund charge different expense ratios? They're going to have different share classes. And so there's going to be variation within funds through the different share classes that they have in retirement plans. And in fact, when we started thinking about this problem, or we've been working on these data sets since 2009, I think. And so one of my co-authors, Clemens Yam, said that he actually had two retirement plans, one at Michigan and one in Texas. And so he said that at some point in time, the very same fund was offered on both retirement plans. And the fees were, and it was, I think it was an S&P 500 index fund, and the fees were vastly different. And so you're going to have to question, why is it that the fees are different? And there are some legitimate reasons that could explain why those fees are different. And there are going to be some reasons that have to do with rent-seeking behavior. So just kind of jumping the gun again, thinking about legitimate reasons, and kind of one of the questions that we already had alluded to this, funds may actually be different because they serve different clientele. So if you imagine Texas professors are trading in and out of this very same fund, while the Michigan guys are just buy and hold, obviously the amount of record keeping charge is going to have to be different. So we're going to have to be mindful of some of the differences that could explain differences in record keeping charges, and also expense ratios and revenue share in general. So not all of it is going to be bad. We are just going to try to pin down whether there's just some excess that shouldn't be there. So in any case, this might be redundant already here, but essentially, as we are going to argue in this paper, there is room for conflict of interest, largely coming from the fact that these compensation schemes are non-transparent. And if they're non-transparent, then these record keepers will have the potential to double charge. And if they can charge more through non-transparent payments, they're going to have an incentive to revenue share with these funds. Now, the other thing that you may wonder is, why would a fund want to revenue share? Essentially, we are going to argue that it's because they would like to have better access to retirement assets. On the flip side, kind of the conflict forum is going to be that if they are engaging in this payment scheme, they're going to have higher expense ratios, which may actually limit the amount of assets that they can attract, even in the retirement space, as there is some sensitivity to fees among kind of employees as well. The last thing on this slide that I'm not going to have much to say about in this paper, but I think it's very, very interesting, is that that this idea of indirect and direct payments creates a lot of inequality across participants. And so unfortunately, we don't have participant level data here, but if you talk to people in the retirement industry who are on kind of advisory boards or any kind of committee for determining what the plan should look like, they tend to dislike Vanguard, because participants are pushing for Vanguard. They are very cheap options, but as I mentioned, Vanguard doesn't revenue share. So what happens is that if you're a very sophisticated participant, you buy into very cheap Vanguard funds. So that's already kind of an edge you have over your unsophisticated peers. But the other problem is going to be that since Vanguard doesn't revenue share, if you're buying into a Vanguard fund, you're not paying your fair share of record keeping fees. And so essentially what ends up happening is that the unsavvy participants are going to be paying higher fees, but they're also going to be holding these very suboptimal funds. So I think there is just a lot to say about these plans, and I feel like a lot we still don't understand about these plans, and as somebody already mentioned, incentives drive everything, and you have all these basically stakeholders in these settings with a variety of incentives, and how those interact is in and of itself very interesting, in my opinion. So like I said, I'm gonna skip this because it's essentially just kind of talking about the same idea. I'm gonna also be very brief on this contribution to the literature. Essentially, there is some research already on distribution channels. A lot of the papers actually focus on the advisory channel. We have heard a lot about these financial advisors recommending certain funds. And this is 100% driven by how they are compensated and what their incentives are in that setting. The two papers that are closest to us are listed in the second group. In particular, I already mentioned Dominique Bedoer and co-author's paper that looks at the regulatory reform, and they show that they're going to be focusing on small and large plans, and show that the tiny plans are going to have kind of a change in how they shift. They're going to have a major shift away from indirect compensation. So let me tell you a little bit about the sample, and then I think Andre recommended that we stop again once I talk about the data. So essentially in this paper, we're going to look at the 1,000 largest 401k plans in the US. The data actually come out of our previous data collection, and so the reason reason why we ended up focusing on the 1,000 largest here is because one of the concerns that I'm sure going to be popping up, it already has started popping up, is that there might be some major differences between funds. There might be some major differences between plans. And so obviously size is going to be an extremely important variable when you think about record keeping charges with economies of scale kicking in. And so we wanted to keep the sample as homogeneous as possible. Of course, we could expand it. We have smaller plans as well. We collected this data from the Department of Labor. In particular, we collected the investment options for the specific plans. We can also just simply pull plan characteristics from Form 5500. And finally, as I mentioned, starting in 2009, the Department of Labor is requiring disclosure of indirect compensation at the payer-payee level. So we ended up collecting that information as well. We then match our sample with the CRISP mutual fund database. And the other thing I wanted to mention here is that ideally, we would like to work at the share class level. And of course, that's where we get the variation, as I mentioned, when we are looking at revenue sharing. Fortunately, for a large percent of our funds, we are going to be able to know which share class is included in the plan. Now, sometimes we are not going to be able to determine that. And so we are going to assume in some cases that it's the lowest or the cheapest share class. But for the majority of our funds, we are actually going to be able to, from various information sources, we are going to be able to figure out which share class is included in the plan. Now, we have approximately we end up with approximately 3,400 plan year observations. And I just noticed it's kind of funny to say the representativeness of the sample. Our sample is not representative of anything but the largest plans, but we are very representative of the largest plans. So in fact, focusing on the top 1,000 largest plans covers approximately 20% of the entire universe. In fact, if we went out to 5,000 plans, we would get 98% of assets. Even though there might be, another 60,000 plans out there, they tend to be so much more tiny than these largest plans that dominate kind of the asset base of this universe. So yeah, so Andre, if you want me to stop here.
Yes. So here's the question. If we think of the management fees as taxes, do we know who bears the burden of the tax, the sponsor or the employees? This will influence how much sponsors care whether employees are overpaying or not.
So I think all these, so all the fees, the management fees, which is going to be part of the expense ratio, is going to be paid by the employees. So I think, as I alluded to it earlier, so the actual payment is going to be made by the employees. And so the employer may have a slight incentive of hiding these payments as well, because they do have to kind of tell the participants how much administrative fees they're going to have to pay for the plan, but they won't, won't say anything about these hidden fees, so to speak. So if the administrative fees are actually paid indirectly through expense ratios, that's not going to be disclosed to participants. So it's definitely the participants.
If employees have to pay higher fees, do they get higher compensation in some other way, higher wages, higher employee match?
So those are good questions. So I think I actually don't think that's, we are not going to have much to say about that. So maybe you're saying that if the plan somehow is inferior because it costs more for participants, I don't think that we can say anything about it in terms of match or anything like that. But my suspicion is that that because these fees are actually hidden, there is not much incentive for the sponsor to actually then come and compensate the employees for this. So again, I don't think so, but I'm not going to be able to say much about it. We'll have match as a variable just to control for how, you know, how employee friendly the sponsor is. And in fact, maybe more employee friendly sponsors that care more about, you know, their workers, maybe they actually provide higher match and at the same time also provide a cheaper plan. So I don't think it's gonna be kind of you know, compensation as opposed to maybe everything is better for more caring employers. Sorry.
Okay, I think we're done at this moment. Thank you.
Okay. So, but these are excellent questions. I think there are lots of things that that, you know, we might be looking at a slice of the puzzle, and there might be another slice that kind of complements some of these. As I said, in this case, I don't think by looking at you know, higher compensation or employer match is actually gonna kind of I don't think that's a missing part of the puzzle in this case, but definitely a good question. So in terms of our data, we are going to have about 54% of our plans are going to be revenue sharing plans. That just means that there's going to be some indirect compensation in these plans. Our plans are tilting towards, or not just tilting, are represented by the very largest plans. So the average plan size in our sample is going to be $1 billion, over $1 billion. So these plans are going to be by far potentially the most sophisticated plans. So in these plans, the sponsor should have a huge benefits department. They should have lots of resources to make sure that you know, they can offer a well-designed retirement plan. So in our opinion, this should be a sample where conflict of interest should probably be kind of the smallest concern. The average account size for participants is only about $79,000. Now you hear on, you know, on the media that retirees or employees are not saving enough for retirement. By looking at the average account balance, you would say that that's probably very, very low. But of course, we don't have the demographics of the employees, so I'm not going to be able to say much about that as well. We have about 22 options on the average menu, and the average plan has about 40% of its options are affiliated options. You guys asked me about employer match. There's roughly an average of 58% match. And then the other thing I wanted to say is we have 18% of our plans are unionized, for instance. We have all these different measures that we're going to try to control for differences in plan characteristics. And I also mentioned that the record keepers tend to provide a number of different services. If you look at the average service codes, we have about 2.5 different services that these record keepers offer. So that's going to be also important in our setup. Administrative expenses tend to be only 6 basis points in this setting. If you look at the Form 5500 universe across all, say, 60,000 retirement plans, the average administrative expense is going to be much higher, 22 basis points. So these are definitely the cheapest plans. And as I mentioned, that makes a whole lot of sense. These are extremely large employees with large benefits departments. Here's kind of a histogram of revenue sharing and non-sharing fund expense ratios. This is share class level. And not surprisingly, you can see that revenue sharing funds tend to be more expensive than non-revenue sharing funds. And this is going to be true not just if you look at all funds, but if you look at domestic equity funds as well. So it's not going to be it's not going to be the case that certain exotic fund styles just happen to revenue share while others are not revenue sharing. You're going to see this across the board. So again, this is share class level expense ratios. Now, in and of itself, this is not a smoking gun. In fact, it doesn't say anything about conflict of interest. If you think about how indirect compensation is administered, as I described in that graph, essentially what happens is that the third-party fund charges the participant for record-keeping fees, and then it kicks it back to the record keeper. But if it charges the participant, then by definition, its expense ratio is going to be higher. So, so just showing that revenue sharing funds are more expensive tells us nothing about conflict of interest in the retirement space. This is only a problem if these higher expense ratios are not offset by lower administrative fees. And so I'll come back to this when we get to it. But essentially, that's exactly what we are going to show, that while these funds are more expensive, the plan charges very high administrative fees as well. And here's kind of a little bit of information on revenue sharing at the option level. You can see that roughly about 55%, 56% of the unaffiliated funds revenue share across the different menus. And conditional on having an indirect compensation arrangement, the average revenue share is about 18 basis points. So that's kind of what you see across the different options. So I'm starting to hurry a little bit because we've gone for about 50 minutes now, but hopefully I'll get to some of the results, and I think we are converging on one for sure. So essentially the first thing that we're going to ask is whether revenue sharing affects the menu design. And in particular, we're going to ask whether, if you're looking at plans where there's revenue sharing, are funds that participate more likely or less likely to be deleted, and funds, you know, and revenue sharing funds, are they more likely to be added or less likely to be added? So for deletion rates, this is going to be kind of, in my opinion, a cooler experiment, because for deletions, you're going to have all these different funds on the menu. And as I mentioned, there's going to be variation within the very same fund, within the same year. You're going to see this fund and revenue sharing plans. And some of these plans, they're going to be revenue sharing on, and some of these plans, they're not going to be revenue sharing on. And so for deletions, you're going to be able to just calculate the frequency of being deleted, conditional on revenue sharing, and the frequency of being deleted conditional on non-sharing. And so I can compare the very same fund and its deletion frequencies across these two settings. So in that case, I'm going to be able to kind of not worry about you know, the argument that maybe these are just different funds driven by different fund characteristics. For addition rates, I'm not going to be able to do this within fund comparison. So there are going to be a couple of more problems with additions. One is, of course, I'm not going to know the true opportunity set. I'm not going to know the set of funds that were being considered, and you know, some of them are added, some of them are not. And even if I observed the true opportunity set, I couldn't actually say, if a fund is not selected, I could never say whether it would have revenue shared and how much it would have revenue shared. So essentially, for additions, we're going to have to follow a different strategy. And we're going to say, let's look at that very same fund and look back and see whether it tends to revenue share in the past. So we are going to calculate the tendency or you know, the frequency of these funds to revenue share on our menus in the past. And we can also calculate the average revenue share. So here we're not going to be comparing within fund, but we are going to be comparing across revenue sharing and non-sharing funds. So there's, I'm just saying there's just going to be a little bit of a difference in the empirical strategy. Now, it's unfortunate that we won't be able to work within fund, but also by using kind of addition tendencies from the past, from other menus, our measure is a little bit less endogenous in the sense that, of course, revenue sharing status has to be endogenous. So in any case, so these are simple univariate statistics for the 4 years in our sample. You can kind of see that revenue sharing funds have a lower frequency of being deleted, and sharing funds that that have the tendency to share in the past have a higher chance of being added to revenue sharing menus. So like I said, this is just univariate statistics, and so I can move on. Essentially, we are going to put this into a Logit framework. And so we are going to run the following models. We are going to look at the probability of being deleted as a function of the actual revenue share that fund had in the specific plan. So this is going to vary again within fund across plans at every single time t. And so that's going to be, sometimes we replace this actual revenue share amount by just a dummy of whether the fund revenue shares on that specific plan or not. For additions, as I mentioned, it's going to be a slightly different measure. It's going to be based on the fund's past tendencies. So there's, it's not going to be varying across plans for the very same fund. Here again, we can use the frequency of revenue sharing in the past, or the actual average amount that the fund has paid across the different menus. So let me show you the deletions model. Here, I don't have all the controls that we put in here, but essentially we have controls for lots of kind of plan characteristics and also fund characteristics. And essentially what you'll see, and we're going to have kind of two variations. We're going to have without fixed effects and with fixed effects. Of course, we know that Logit models are a little bit tricky with fixed effects. I'll talk a little bit about linear probability in a minute. But essentially what we see here is consistently across the different models, revenue sharing funds are less likely to be deleted, and the higher the pay the revenue share is, the less likely to be deleted. And if you look at other variables, they seem to make sense. Better performers are less likely to be deleted. More expensive funds are more likely to be deleted. You can kind of see larger funds are going to be less likely to be deleted, and so on and so forth. Like I said, for deletions, we are also going to run some linear probability models with different fixed effects, and the results are extremely robust across. So essentially, like I said, in a multivariate context, it's very clear that within the same within the same fund, the very same fund is going to be less likely to be deleted from a revenue sharing plan if it actually revenue shares with the record. For additions, you see a very similar picture coming out. The probability of revenue sharing or past tendency to revenue share is positively associated with being added to the menu, and the average amount paid is also positively associated with being added to the menu. Now, we are using Logit models mostly because additions, just like in our previous paper, in terms of scaling, it makes sense to use nonlinear models. But essentially, as I mentioned, even the setup is slightly different between deletions and additions. So my co-authors and I have a conversation about this a lot. I'm not a particular fan of fund additions, so we decided to kind of make me happier by running a placebo test as well. Notice that these tests are run by revenue sharing plans. So these are going to be plans where revenue sharing takes place. And the conclusion is that the tendency to revenue share is positively associated with being added to the plan. Now, we shouldn't see this if we actually look at non-sharing plans. If you look at non-sharing plans, they shouldn't care about the fund's past tendency to pay a rebate on previous menus, and that's exactly what you see. For non-sharing plans, there is no relation between past tendencies and revenue sharing. Also wanted to add that this is not something that we can run for deletions. So we cannot break out deletions into a non-sharing subsample, because on non-sharing plans, nobody shares. So, you know, the revenue share, the actual revenue share for deletions is always going to be 0. So
let me, Veronika, sorry, let me ask a couple of questions, and then probably we can suspend the rest till the end of the presentation.
Okay.
So don't deletions depend on the entire menu and what will replace the deleted fund?
No, that's a good question. So deletions would depend on the entire menu. So one of the things that that kind of the I guess the incumbent funds, so to speak, incumbent ensemble, I think that's the word we use in our previous paper as well. So it depends on what other options you have. So for instance, if funds that that are related to other funds on the menu are much more likely to be deleted. So if they have a higher correlation with existing funds on the menu. So definitely the incumbent ensemble matters a whole lot. And in terms of replacement, that's an extremely tricky question, to be honest. And it's a very, very good question. So for this paper, we haven't played around with it, but with our previous paper, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out kind of where the money goes and where it comes from and where it goes. It's extremely difficult for us, given the aggregation of our plans, to figure out what happens to the money. And a lot of the times, actually, there is no replacement fund. So some of that money is going to be just kind of reallocated across the existing investment options. And when there is an addition, even then it's not clear whether the deleted fund actually gets kind of replaced by the added fund or not. So this is a very tough question, very good question. We do everything we can to control for kind of plan characteristics, but where the money goes is kind of a black box.
Okay, so the within fund comparisons mean that investment objective is the same, but the clienteles served are still different. Common for a single fund to have different share classes that serve different clienteles, for example, individual versus institutional share classes. Is something similar going on here? Or put differently, what drives revenue sharing in Plan A versus not in Plan B?
So we already touched upon this a little bit. Very good question again. Obviously, if you think about the different share classes, the only difference between the share classes, the fees, is the services being provided, and that's kind of analogous to saying to clientele, because different clientele will require different services. Because if it's the very same fund, it's the very same portfolio, the very same portfolio manager. So there is really no difference in, you know, kind of management charge. It has to do with the service charge. So this is an important question, because we want to avoid, and if we get there, I'm not sure if we will, but I'm going to have a table, well, maybe we'll get there. I'm going to have a table in a minute on comparing revenue sharing and non-sharing plans, because one important concern that you may have, and it sounds like that's the important question that we have here, is that maybe these plans are just different. Maybe their clientele is different, and it's kind of going back to that analogy of the same fund on the Michigan plan and the Texas plan. It's charging different fees. On the one hand, the clientele seems on many dimensions similar. These are large, very, very large universities. The clientele essentially is academic staff at very large universities. But like I said, even then, you could have differences, because some clients might be super active and they trade in and out of funds. Obviously, that's going to be really expensive to record keep, versus somebody who just does a buy and hold strategy. So in these analyses, we are going to have a host of controls, and of course, we'll try to use fixed effects whenever we can to control for this within plan, within fund, and things like that. But even fund characteristics and plan characteristics, we are going to worry about the clientele exactly. So we are going to worry about what type of plan it is. We're going to worry about how active the participants are in terms of flowing in and out. And to be honest, that's going to be the hardest thing about this, to kind of pin down what's the fair record keeping cost and what is kind of extra rent. And so we are going to be pretty careful in terms of acknowledging that some of it, there's nothing wrong with charging higher fees if these fees are actually providing clients with something that the other plan is not doing. The other thing I wanted to mention that, and I've been kind of saying this before, by focusing on the very largest plans, that's another way for us to kind of worry about clientele. And so trying to kind of compare very homogeneous kind of customers, so to speak. But of course, size is not going to be the only dimension on which you must have homogeneity.
So last question for the moment, and we're going to delete all other questions till the end. So do larger sponsors have greater bargaining power? Also, it is likely that their 401ks are cheaper to manage because of economies of scale. Both should show up in lower fees. Is it possible to distinguish between these two effects?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it's possible to distinguish between those two effects, but you're absolutely right. Larger sponsors will have a lot more bargaining power because they are offering, access to a much larger pool of assets. And getting access to these retirement assets is extremely important for mutual funds. If you look at the growth of the mutual fund industry and the growth of the retirement industry, you're going to see that, and I already mentioned this, retirement plans are the single largest distribution channel for these funds. When you get access to a really large plan, there's going to be, there are going to be a lot of advantages. And so one advantage that seems to come through from previous studies is that participants tend to be fairly inactive. So there's just not much going on in terms of flowing in and out of funds. And you're also going to have your reliable contributions coming in periodically into the fund. And so funds absolutely love the stability of these flows. Now, my co-author has a paper that shows that actually the stability of the flows is only true at shorter horizons, because if the fund does get delisted from the menu, then it's going to be a huge huge shock and a huge outflow. So participants tend to be very inactive, but there is a lot of reshuffling in this plan. So clearly there's going to be a huge negotiating power. Clearly, record-keeping fees should have a huge economies of scale component. So you should see, and you do see that very clearly. I mentioned it to you that, for instance, administrative fees in our sample would only be about 6 basis points if you kind of take the administrative fees off of Form 5500 and divide it by total plan assets. If you do the same exercise for small plans, in the average, the universe of 4500 plans, it's going to be more like 22 basis points. So there's going to be a huge difference. And so our sample tilts towards these very largest plans, and exactly for that homogeneity that we're trying to achieve by this. But at the same time, there's still a lot of variation. And so that's why we are going to be controlling for these plan characteristics and everything else to make sure that, that we are kind of acknowledging some of these issues.
Thank you.
So kind of let's get straight to it. I think I only have 5 minutes left or so. So I'm going to show you a couple of more things, and then so basically, so far we've been looking at the menu itself, and argued that it seems like that record keepers do prefer revenue sharing funds, and so the underlying argument behind it is that they would do so if they can actually get higher compensation through indirect arrangements. And so we're going to ask whether revenue sharing funds are actually associated with higher fees. You already saw the histograms. I already told you that this is not even surprising. So the answer here is going to be yes. But the question is, does it mean that these are going to be offset by lower administrative costs? And here the answer is going to be no. Or alternatively, maybe it kind of goes back to the clientele and the services being provided. Maybe revenue sharing plans have these record keepers that seek out the very best funds for their clients. And in that case, they may charge extra for that finder's fee or whatever you want to call it. And in that case, you would see that these funds are more expensive, but hey, they're actually much better. So these are kind of the issues that we're going to look at next. Now, as I mentioned, one big concern and one big elephant in the room, and it's been coming up, clearly participants are understanding these issues, is that that you might have a lot of endogeneity concerns. So funds that revenue share could be very different from funds that do not. Plans that revenue share may have very different clientele, may have very different characteristics. Sponsors may be completely different across these plans as well. As I mentioned, in our analyses, we'll try to mitigate these concerns with plan, fund, record keeper, fixed defects. But of course, we are going to try to control for a lot of these characteristics. But this is going to be kind of hanging in the back of your mind. Are these plans very different? And so the first table I'm going to show you is we actually kind of try to see if revenue sharing and non-sharing plans are actually different. And so we're going to look at various characteristics, but the underlying theme in this table is going to be that maybe imagine that some plans have revenue sharing, some plans do not. It's possible that revenue sharing plans are simply more expensive to record keep. And as I mentioned already, nobody likes to tell participants, hey, the administrative fees are really, really high. So both the sponsor and the record keeper may actually have an incentive to kind of take the extra fee and charge it through indirect arrangements. So it's very possible that that these are just different plans. Cost of record keeping is very different, and so therefore you see these indirect compensation arrangements. So we're going to look at a bunch of these characteristics that could kind of tell us something about that. Of course, economies of scale already came up. There is a slight difference between the size. It's not super significant, and if you actually include plans where we know there is revenue share, we just don't know how much, that difference kind of goes away. So I think there might be a little bit of economy of scale left in our sample, but I think that's not that big a concern. And you can kind of see for account sizes it goes the other direction. The other way to think about the cost of record keeping is how active the participants are. It doesn't seem like there's much difference between revenue sharing and non-sharing plans. You can look at the different options that they offer. If they have a larger variety of options or more complex options, you should see differences and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm really running out of time, so I'm not gonna bore you with this, but generally speaking, we don't see much. The only thing that kind of pops up is proprietary funds, which goes the opposite direction, and then unions, depending on your maybe political beliefs, you could kind of spin stories as to why unions matter, but those are the only characteristics that kind of show up. So Andre, should I start concluding or show a few?
Yeah, let's take a few minutes. Let's go for a few minutes more just to see
Okay.
the results.
Okay, so I'm gonna be really brief here. So essentially, what I'm gonna show you guys is just a couple of more results. I showed you already the histogram in terms of the relation between revenue sharing and expense ratios. We put it in a multivariate framework, and you can kind of see that revenue sharing is positively associated with the expense ratio. And again, like I said, it is not the smoking gun. Revenue sharing funds just have a higher expense ratio because part of it gets kicked back to the record keeper. What happens then is it offset by administrative costs? And so then we ask whether revenue sharing plans have, maybe they have the same costs, they are just charged differently, through direct and indirect payments. And so what we actually see is that both the expense ratios that I already showed you and the total cost of the plan that includes administrative fees is higher for revenue sharing plans. That is, there is no offset. Administrative fees are not lower just because these expense ratios are lower. And finally, I also wanted to show you that these revenue sharing funds are actually not better. In fact, they are worse than non-sharing funds. These are performance percentiles. And so if you look at the average non-sharer fund, these percentiles are calculated through the CRISP universe. They tend to be slightly better than the average fund or the median fund in CRISP. The revenue sharing funds are right around the median fund increase, so they are not better. But a lot of this is simply driven by the fees. They actually are worse even after you account for fees, but the economic magnitude of this is not very large. So let me say one more thing, and then I'm gonna completely conclude. I hate to run over. Essentially, what we are trying to say in this paper is that you have these indirect arrangements, and they tend to kind of create higher costs to participants. The performance is not offsetting these higher costs, and they seem to also affect menu design. Something really cool about this sample, and this is a fairly new paper, as I mentioned, so we have not fully kind of exploited this characteristic, but I think it's really, really nice in this setting. I tend to compare it to the VC network structure. So essentially what you see in this setting is take a plan, you have a lead provider, say Fidelity, and through open architecture, you have all these other management companies that are going to show up on the plan. So you can kind of think about it as a syndicate with the record keeper being the lead syndicate. Then you take another plan, and there, say, T. Rowe Price is the lead syndicate, and Fidelity may or may not be in this setting. And so you're going to see this really interesting network structure across these providers. And so in the last part of this paper, we try to think about negotiating power, and we are just looking at third-party funds and the record keeper itself, kind of not worrying about the other stakeholders that may also have negotiating power. But we're going to look at, for instance, how influential the record keeper is, how influential some of these management companies are in these 401k plans, whether they have reciprocal relationships with each other, meaning that sometimes one is a record keeper and the other one is on the menu as in the syndicate. And in another menu, they just kind of switch roles, but they are kind of in the same network. And so what we're going to show is that, for instance, these reciprocal relationships will reduce revenue sharing arrangements. We'll also look at how much competition there is. So if Fidelity has a bunch of these funds that they could offer as, from their own proprietary lineup, yet they are not offering that, yet that fund is offered by a different service provider, you would expect that that different service provider really has to pay to play, so to speak. because Fidelity could actually kind of step in and offer those options. So that's kind of the last part of the paper. We're going to look at market power and revenue sharing, and these results actually show that more powerful record keepers tend to have higher revenue sharing arrangements, and these, like I said, reciprocal relationships matter as well. So I'm going to stop here. This last part, I think we haven't tapped into quite as much as we should, because it's an extremely interesting network. Here, I probably would say that that we need to kind of think about strengthening some of these analyses. We are looking at potential mergers between provider shocks to these networks. Right now, it's simply just using fixed effects, so it's more of a, I would say we are uncovering correlations at this point, more so than kind of causal relationships. But I think this part of the paper is very exciting because of the structure of the data. So thanks again, Andre. And if you guys have any other kind of comments or ways to kind of tackle some of these challenges, it would be great if you could send me an email or send the organizer an email. Thank you.
So, Veronika, I know you're out of time, but we have some really, really wonderful comments, and I would like to ask just a couple more.
Okay.
So, from the graph, it seems index funds don't revenue share. Is the rise of passive investing helping to kill revenue sharing?
That's a good question. So I actually, so the only graph I showed you is equity, domestic equity versus everybody. But at some point, we actually looked at whether exotic funds have a higher tendency, or plain vanilla funds have a higher tendency to revenue share. And you don't see much of a pattern except one, which is exactly what the question points to. Index funds do not tend to revenue share quite as often as you would think. Now, also interestingly, in the last part of the sample, this is a Vanguard effect. So essentially, a large majority of the index funds now are provided by, especially plain vanilla S&P 500 index funds are going to be provided by Vanguard. As I mentioned, Vanguard does not refuses to revenue share in these 401k plans. Now, the second part of this question is kind of push towards indexing. Sure, it could be a possibility. Now, I also have a paper with Clemens Rina and another co-author that talks about regulatory reforms, disclosure reforms on fees, for instance, in these 401k plans. And we actually argue that potentially some of these reforms push individuals towards indexing themselves. So, some of the push towards indexing may actually come from retirement plans.
All right, there are a few more questions, but I'm going to send you them in the chat so you have the opportunity to look over them later. Thank you very much again for agreeing to present for a wonderful presentation. And please join me in thanking Veronika for the presentation. So this